Hi, good morning everyone. Let's get started with the next topic for this training session, which is on workload analysis. Okay, so basically we will be looking about the performance bottlenecks in this chapter and the ways to analyze the performance issues. So here you can see that system bottlenecks could be because of the hardware. In the hardware, it includes CPU, the RAM, the IOs, the network, and it could be because of the configuration, basically the memory, the buffer, the configuration and process configuration is not tuned properly. Okay, so next thing is a long running programs. That is the unnecessary functionality, non-optimal implementation, basically the technical implementation, for example, the database indexes, table buffering, ABAP coding. Okay, then in the long running program, it includes logical implementation, that is non-optimal use of SAP standard functionality. Long running program may cause system bottlenecks, and system bottlenecks may cause long running programs. So it's a, you can say, catch 21 situation where if you have system bottlenecks you will have long running programs, and if you have long running programs you will have system bottlenecks. Okay, so there comes the basis part, basically the tuning activities. You need to optimize the system parameters, that is R3 parameters, for example, for memory management, database parameters, for example, for database buffer sizes, operating system and network parameters. So these are the three different layers at which you need to tune the parameters. Next thing is you need to optimize the disk layout just to make sure that you are balancing the IO. Okay, next is the optimization of workload distribution. That is, you need to make sure that there are enough number of work processes, the background jobs, that is background work processes, and log on groups, they are doing an optimal distribution of the load. Okay, then finally the hardware sizing by detecting the hardware bottlenecks. So these are the four key areas of tuning the performance. Okay, then application tuning task. Basically you need to go to the SAP marketplace and find out the fixes, the bug fixes, the corrections, the patches, the hints of tuning your application. Okay, then is optimize the SAP customizing. For example, go to the SD, the PP, and find out ways to optimize the programs. Optimize ABAP coding of customers modification, for example, Z reports, user exits. Okay, then you may need to create some indexes, drop the indexes, change the indexes so that you have the indexes on the right fields. Okay, then design table buffering, that is identify which tables requires buffering, what type of buffering those tables require, whether you need to buffer the entire table or you can buffer a particular key field, or you can buffer the generic fields. Okay, this is showing you an overview of the multi-tier client server architecture. So at the top layer you can see the presentation layer where you have your PCs and the monitors and your laptops, your iPads. Okay, then below that you have your internet facing layer. It could be your ITS, that is transaction server, could be a web server. Behind that is your application server, which is a SAP application server, and below that is a database server. Okay, now let's see the breakup of the response time when you are connecting from the presentation layer, that is from your PC when you are trying to access a particular transaction in SAP, how much time it takes. Okay, so we need to see before we access a particular transaction, there is a wait time involved depending on how much your work process is loaded. Say for example you have 20 work processes and all of them are loaded, then there will be a wait time till any of process is released. So you have the wait queue in memory. Okay, so that is the application layer. Now next is the roll-in time. Basically, when a user is dispatched to a work process, that is user context data, the user's logon, attributes, authorization, and other relevant information is transferred from the role buffer, extended buffer, or the role file into the work process. This transfer of user context data into work process memory is known as roll-in. Okay, so roll-in of memory takes place. Then next, transaction processing begin once the roll-in happens. So roll-in basically it copies the user's context into the memory. Okay, the context includes things like the logon information. Okay, so let's go to the next slide where we are talking about the next the response time component, which is the database processing. If data from database is required to support transaction processing, a request for data is sent to database interface, which in turn sends a request to the network to retrieve the information from the database. When it receives the request, the database searches its shared memory buffers. If the data is found, it is sent back to the work process. And if the data is not found, it is loaded from the disk into the shared memory buffers. Okay, so we'll be covering this into detail in the table buffering. Okay, so after being located, the data is taken from the shared memory buffers and sent back across the network to the requesting database interface. And then the transactional processing begins. Okay, next slide. It's basically talking about the SAP buffers. Okay, before accessing the database service, the database interface searches for data in the R3 buffer itself. Okay, so if the data is found in the buffer, data is given from the shared pool buffer, and if it is not found, it is sent to the database. So this increases the performance quite a lot. Next is the response time. So all of these components we have covered so far. So which are the components we covered? We have covered things like the database response time, the roll-in memory time, the time which is taken by the processor, by the dispatcher, and the time for a shared pool buffer to give the data. So all this combination of all this gives a total response time. Okay, so next is the rollout time. After the transaction finishes and the work process is no longer required, the user context is rolled out of the work process. Okay, this is basically the summary of showing all the different times that we have discussed so far. You can see the initial, which is the wait time. You have the roll-in time. Then there is database request time, and this total is the response time. Okay, so next is the CPU time. CPU time is the amount of time during which a particular work process has active control of the central processing unit. That's the CPU time. Okay, so the next thing is the workload time. Okay, the workload time statistics include the response time in millisecond. Starts when a user, say this is your user, it is trying to access a transaction which is accessing the database layer. Okay, so this response time in milliseconds starts when the user request enters the dispatcher queue, that is the first activity. Okay, ends when the next screen is written to the user. The response time doesn't include the time to transfer from the screen to the front end. Okay, next is the wait time. As we saw, this is the time a user request sits in the dispatcher queue. It starts when user request is entered in the dispatcher queue and ends when the request starts being processed. Roll-in time in millisecond, that is the amount of time needed to roll user context information into the work process. Load time, basically this is the time needed to load from the database and generate objects like ABAP source code, CUA, screen information. Then you have the processing time. This is equivalent to response time minus the sum of wait time, database request time, load time, roll time, enqueue time. Okay, then we have the database request time, we have the CPU time. Okay, so this is about the workload. Okay, let's go to the transaction ST02 or ST03N, where we will see the workload monitor. Okay, so let's go there. So let me minimize this window. Okay, now let me go to the SAP window. Okay, we are in the ST03N transaction. Okay, here you can see this is the workload. These are the workload statistics. You have the detailed analysis. You can have the analysis by, say, response time, by transaction. Okay, then you have BI workload, you have CRM workload. So if I expand this detailed analysis tab, okay, so by expanding the detailed analysis tab, we'll see the details of the response time. Okay, so that is about the ST03 transaction that I was talking about. Okay, so we can go to the newer ones, ST03N, they are pretty much the same. Okay, then here we can see the information like, okay, so let's go to that particular slide. Give me a second. Okay, so what we just saw is the different response time, the dialog time components. Okay, so these are the different things that we have just seen. Okay, so that's what actually I wanted to cover in this particular training session. Thank you for joining and have a nice day.